Although Russell T Davies had to write 8 out of 13 episodes for this series, he had 4 other writers to help him, and Mark Gatiss is the first one out of the gate. And what Mark did was he went to topics he loved, such as the 19th century, Charles Dickens, and death! Mark Gatiss had the unenviable task of having to follow Russell once Russell had established the tone of the show. So let's see how he did. It's time to exhume the Unquiet Dead. All the writers of this series got their start writing Doctor Who for various spin-off ranges, including the Virgin New Adventures, and right here is Mark's first published piece of Doctor Who. It is the novel Nightshade. If you hunt around for it, you can actually find it for free online. There's also a Big Finish adaptation, but I recommend seeking out the book. The Big Finish adaptation has to cut a lot out, including some of the characters, which in my opinion really changes the story. Now, I bring up Nightshade because there are some similarities between this and the Unquiet Dead. Namely, the title character, Professor Nightshade, is played by an actor, and that actor in his later years starts seeing the monsters from his television series. Here, of course, Charles Dickens starts seeing the ghosts that he never thought were real, now coming to life, or unlife, as the case may be. Simon Callow appears as Charles Dickens, and this is the first example of what Doctor Who will do at least one of a year generally, and that is the celebrity historical episode. Now, the classic series kind of shied away from this model, because very early on, in the 1960s, when stories basically alternated between historical and science fictional, one of the first historicals, the first big historical, was Marco Polo, which dealt with the character of Marco Polo. And teachers wrote into the BBC and said, look, it's very good of you to put this educational stuff about history in, but we're now having to kind of set straight what the program got wrong about Marco Polo. So for that reason, Doctor Who then started to avoid historical figures. Generally, they would sometimes be on the periphery of a story, like Napoleon and Robespierre in the Reign of Terror, and we get a little cameo from Shakespeare. We of course get Nero and King Richard in season 2, but they're not quite as central to the story as Marco Polo was, and indeed the historical accuracy was slightly better if you ignore the middle-aged Nero when he was actually a young man. Doctor Who would of course soon do away with the pure historical after Patrick Troughton's departure, and indeed this is not a pure historical. This is a historical with science fiction elements, which is generally what Doctor Who did. Now, by bringing in Charles Dickens, we're very clearly seeing the educational remit of the show happening again, and it's expertly done by Mark by having the Doctor be a massive fan of Charles Dickens. With the Doctor being a fan of Charles Dickens, it tells us in a way that Charles Dickens is cool, and the Doctor rattles off various titles of Charles Dickens' works, and the plot reflects some of Charles Dickens' works as well, notably A Christmas Carol, as Dickens notices that the Gelf resemble what he imagined Marley's face in The Door Knocker to be like. Casting Simon Callow as Charles Dickens is a splendid choice as well, because Callow is a huge fan of Dickens and a spectacular actor. At this time, he was probably most famous for being in 4 Weddings and a Funeral, and also, for me, he was most famous for a little sitcom called Chance in a Million, and I don't know if anyone's seen it, but he really showed off his comedy chops in that. Here is Charles Dickens. Callow shows off the research he has put in because Simon Callow does one-man shows as Charles Dickens. He is that much of a fan and that much of a brilliant actor. And where I think Mark Gatiss is particularly clever in the way he's written Dickens is he has brought Dickens' sceptical side to the plot. Dickens, of course, was a very famous writer, even at the time he was alive. He not only published novels, but those novels were serialised in daily papers. He did give public readings like this, and people, as you see in the episode, would flock just to see the man read his story. Not to see an adaptation, not to see a play of it, but to see the man himself read it. And Dickens was on record as saying, yes, look, I write about ghosts and I write about spooky things, but they don't exist. And went even as far as to say spiritual mediums are phonies, they're taking your money. So you take that skeptical Charles Dickens and you throw him into a situation where, yep, ghosts are real. So straight away you have tension there. Reading the production history of this story, some of the early drafts and early ideas did have a spiritual medium character who, was performing a con, and suddenly the ghosts are real. But in a way, I think it's far more important to have everyone in the story be exactly as they appear to be. Now, even though, Sneed is a bit creepy and a bit sleazy, Rose says, wandering hands, and he does chloroform Rose as well, his deceitful actions, like trying to cover up the death of Mr. Redpath, they come from a desperation rather than a desire to deceive. Gwyneth, of course, is an unwilling accomplice to all this, being a servant. If she doesn't do what Sneed says, she'll be dismissed, and she has no one else in the world. But she does also point out that Sneed can be a good man. By having these two normal characters, if you like, it throws Dickens' skepticism into sharp relief. If we had have had a medium who was fleecing people, there would have been a bit more ambiguity in the plot, whereas here, the central dilemma for Dickens is whether he can accept both that, what he's been crusading for, the real physical world triumphing over, con artists who'll tell you that, yes, they can talk to your relatives, and the relatives want you to keep getting readings so they can keep sending you messages, versus the actual reality of there are these ghosts. But of course, being Doctor Who, they're not ghosts, they're aliens. Aliens. Now, something there was a bit of criticism for last week's episode with Rose getting knocked out happens again here, but I think it works a bit better here because it happens as a result of Rose being brave and attempting to investigate, whereas in the End of the World she's just walking down a corridor and the adherence of the repeated meme renders her unconscious, let's say. Whereas here, Rose is trying to investigate the plot, she is trying to get justice for Mrs. Peace, the dead woman, so there's not much justice to be had there. And also Rose rejoins the plot immediately, and her waking up in that room with the two zombies does move the plot forward and tell us more about what's going on. Generally, it's another great week for Rose. She has a great period costume, which I do have to wonder though, with the off-to-the-shoulder bit, if that's a little modern concession, but I don't know enough about 19th century fashion to comment one way or the other on that. And she gets those wonderful moments with Gwyneth where they're just two young women talking about life. It's educational again because it tells us how things were different in 1869 to how they are now, even attitudes around sex and romance, as well as working life and social life. When the Doctor wants to use Gwyneth to help the Gelth get through, it's Rose who objects to that, and I like Rose pushing against the Doctor on that, and I like that he doesn't sugarcoat his answer for her. He brings up, donating bodies, it's just like donating your organs after you die. And also that she has to get used to a different morality travelling around time and space, and especially travelling in history. And we would see that in the classic series as well, when characters would object to something happening in a historical setting, and the Doctor would say, you can't change that, as we get in the Aztecs. But when Gwyneth pushes against Rose, that is such an important moment, because up until this point, Rose has been seeing these historical characters as a bit stupid because they don't have what she has in the future. But for Gwyneth to call Rose out like that, it proves the intelligence of the character. And watching this, I never felt particularly that Gwyneth wasn't intelligent, but Rose thinks that because Gwyneth doesn't have the same level of independence as Rose does 30 years in the future. And it's a good reminder that whenever we go back in history, we as the audience are going to encounter attitudes that are different from the present day stories and the future stories. And that's important to establish for the new audience as well. The conclusion, look, it is another character saving the Doctor. Gwyneth gives up her life, first of all, to let the Gelth through, and then when she realises that they are villains, she agrees to end it. And according to the Doctor, she was already dead, and some other force, if you like, was driving her. It's an effective and emotional moment, And it's a little uncomfortable as well, because it's the Doctor who insisted that these beings come through because of his guilt with the Time War, but it's someone else who has to pay the price, and of course Mr. Sneed is killed in the process too. And so the only survivors are the Doctor, Dickens, and Rose. Now, confession time. I've often felt that Mark Gatiss' work is reliable and entertaining, but it rarely engaged with me on an emotional level. And I have to say, watching this episode again this time, it's finally hitting me emotionally, Mark Gatiss' writing, and I'm very glad of that, because it was a matter of whenever I saw his name coming up in episodes in following series, I'm like, oh, okay, this will be an enjoyable 45 minutes of television, and then kind of forgettable for me. This episode has gone up in my estimation. It's an 8 out of 10, fantastic period piece, great design work, really good acting, and just a wonderful first historical story for the new series. Now it's time for the viewer mailbag. First up, Matt. The Unquiet Dead. Mark Gatiss' best script for televised too, and is a pretty decent ghost story to boot. Look, I think his best script will come much later in The Crimson Horror, but as I say, this has gone up in my estimation, and it is a pretty good ghost story as well, using the tropes of ghost stories, but giving us plausible scientific explanations. Pertwee would be proud. Blaine Coughlin writes, The Unquiet Dead. It's a shame that all those beautiful Victorian Cardiff scenes were filmed during what looks like a 4/7 gale ripping through the streets, with Simon Callow visibly struggling to catch his breath and even stay on his feet for the final shot. I do wonder, Blaine, if those scenes were shot first, and then the scenes in studio, in Sneed's house, were shot second, because Dickens does get a little bit tipsy after the seance, and I wonder if that was kind of an explanation, and it's just like, oh no, he's just a bit drunk, you know. Understandable under the circumstances. From Stephen Alexander, this is a Big Finish story, literally phantasmagoria, on TV, isn't it? Slightly pedestrian. Mark Gatiss, as well as writing the third TV Doctor Who story, wrote the second Big Finish story, being Phantasmagoria. And again, that had a similar historical setting to this, because that is one of Mark Gatiss' go-tos. As for pedestrian, look, I used to think so, and I've reappraised it recently, but given that I used to think so, I suppose I have to partially agree with you. Very Pete Lambert writes, Unquiet. An entire classic episode 1 refined into a pre-credit sequence that's basically our first cliffhanger since Survival Part 2. A bona fide theatrical household name actor giving a guest star turn perfectly. Spooky bits! My first 10 out of 10 of New Who. Doctor Who very often now will condense what would have been part 1 of a classic series story into that pre-titles. And this one is genuinely scary. On the Blu-ray, you can hear Redpath's neck break. I always wondered, why, she gives him a light neck massage and he dies. No, it's genuinely scary. And that scream and the actress's face as she walks towards the camera, really, really well done. Johnny Morris says, The Unquiet Dead is oddly slow and generic. Rose is written as Ace? Yeah, you know what, she's got a bit of gumption, and you can imagine Ace especially giving the don't imagine I didn't know your hands were going for a wander, you dirty old man. I can really imagine Sophie Aldred giving that. Yeah, definitely. If this is generic, though, give me more. If this is generic bog standard level, give me more of this. I enjoyed it. And Stephen Leader over on YouTube says, loved The Unquiet Dead and the first 5 minutes of Aliens of London, but we'll get to that next time. The first 3 episodes are my all-time fave for New Who. I think they are just about perfect in drama, comedy, and style. The comedy of this episode is brilliantly written. Mark Gatiss has said in interviews that he was going to go more comedic, but decided not to. And I'm really glad that was the case, that he decided not to, because there's just a few nice little jokes in there, and I particularly love when Sneed is talking about how having a haunted house is actually good for the Undertaker business, and the smile on Eccleston's face. I love the way Eccleston does comedy. I know I've said it before, doing Rose, but I think he actually pitches it perfectly, and the happy medium line, he is so proud of that dad joke, and I love it. Scarves and Celery says, The Unquiet Dead is mostly solid, a lovely introduction to Doctor Who in the past, with a beautifully realised Victorian Cardiff and excellent character moments like Rose and the Doctor clashing over the morality of letting the Gelth use corpses, and Gwyneth confronting Rose for patronising her intelligence. I think it would have been more interesting and less inadvertently reactionary episode if it had found a more nuanced source of the final act's conflict than the alien refugees were lying about wanting to live peacefully with us. You raise a really good point there, Scarves and Celery, and I do think it is inadvertent. Now, Mark Gatiss has commented on that in various interviews because he is constantly interviewed about Doctor Who. Outside of the three showrunners of modern Doctor Who, he's the most prolific writer. He also co-created Sherlock with Stephen Moffat. And Gatiss has said, look, it wasn't his intention to write the story in that way. It wasn't his intention to paint people seeking help as being duplicitous, as a general thing. It was, this is a Doctor Who thing, this is a sci-fi thing. These aliens aren't telling the truth because they're the villains, not because they're refugees. Science fiction was invented, if you like, as a way to comment on our own society in the 1800s, but that also brings with it the danger of you can read an allegory into a text that wasn't intended by the author. And look, I don't have an answer to settle this. I think reading the text as criticising refugees is a valid reading. We even have Sneed referring to them as foreigners when he's trying to understand. But I also believe Gatiss when he says that wasn't his intention. His intention was to write a yarn with these ghosts who would trick the Doctor into allowing them to come to Earth, and then the Doctor has to stop them, because that's classic Doctor Who. You know, that is how Doctor Who works. There's no easy answer here, and I think we would diminish both the story and the argument in order to say definitively it's one thing or another. You know what, it probably wouldn't have happened in any other series subsequently. But because they were learning how to make the show, that's what we got here. And sent in after recording is this comment from Dwayne Bunny of the Sirens of Audio podcast. I adore The Unquiet Dead. I particularly find the 19th century fascinating. What a spooky way to open the episode with the possessed corpse's mouth opening into the title vortex sequence. Yeah, that's a great moment. The Ninth Doctor is childlike at the prospect of adventure, and I love the fun banter between him and Dickens. I'm a sucker for historicals, so with this being set in my favourite period, it just pips the empty child. I always find myself enjoying the Gatiss episodes, contrary to popular fan opinion, so I guess I like his writing style. Now, the thing is, I had never particularly been under the impression that Gatiss's writing wasn't popular in fandom. I thought that I was in the minority, kind of not connecting with it, but a few people now have said that it seems to be a fan consensus, and I look forward to re-examining this because I am intending to do later series as well. So that brings us to the end of another review. Exciting news next week. Say Something Nice will return on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, so do come back for that. And also next week, I will be bringing you my review on Aliens of London. Sorry. Until then, please do like, share, and subscribe. It really helps me out, especially if you click the notification button, and even just clicking a like. If your account is connected to Twitter, it automatically tweets out my video to your followers, so that would be fantastic. But whether you do that or not, have a wonderful week, stay safe, and remember to wash your hands. Thank you so much for watching.